What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? The night was meant to be a celebration, laughter, champagne, and new beginnings. But when he raised his glass, claiming what was never his, the air turned cold. 3 weeks ago, an old man's trembling hands had given her a box. Inside was the truth, undeniable, unchangeable. And yet, here he stood, declaring a lie with absolute certainty. Had he deceived everyone, or was he just another pawn? One thing was clear, this night would change everything. Stay. The truth is about to surface. The chandelier's golden light shimmered against the polished mahogany floors, reflecting off crystal glasses filled to the brim with champagne. Laughter and the clinking of silverware echoed through the grand estate as guests raised their drinks, toasting to a new beginning. It should have been a celebration. Knox Wilder stood at the center of the room, the embodiment of effortless confidence. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored black suit, he held his glass high, his smirk unwavering. The grandson of the late Henry Wilder, Knox had always been the golden boy, ruthless in ambition, fearless in pursuit, and utterly indifferent to anything that didn't serve his interests. Yet tonight, he played the part of the grieving heir well. "To my grandfather," Knox announced, his voice rich and commanding, demanding attention. Henry Wilder was a great man, a legend in his own right. And while his passing leaves a void in all our hearts, he paused, just long enough for dramatic effect. He made sure his legacy lived on. He turned slightly, eyes sweeping across the room, reveling in the anticipation. Then, with the casual ease of a man who had just won everything, he declared, "As you all know, my grandfather's lake house was his most cherished property. And I am honored to say that he has entrusted it to me." A wave of polite applause followed, but it barely registered in Ivy Quinn's ears. She froze. The champagne glass in her hand trembled ever so slightly, the ice clinking against the delicate rim. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out the hum of conversation. This couldn't be right. 3 weeks ago, her grandfather had given her a small wooden box, his frail fingers wrapping around hers with quiet urgency. Inside, she had found the official deed to the lake house, signed, notarized, an indisputable transfer of ownership. It was hers, not his. So why was Knox standing there, so sure, so smug, as if this had been promised to him all along? Ivy inhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay composed. Around her, guests murmured in surprise, some raising their glasses to Knox in congratulations, others exchanging puzzled glances. Henry had never mentioned leaving the lake house to Knox. In fact, Knox had never cared for it. He had always dismissed it as an outdated relic, something beneath his concern. And yet, now, he spoke as if it had always been his. Ivy's stomach twisted. Something was very, very wrong. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but her face remained unreadable. Years of carefully navigating high society events had trained her well. She wouldn't cause a scene, not yet. But one thing was certain. Someone was lying. And she was going to find out who. Ivy could feel the walls closing in, the air in the room thick with something unspoken, something sinister. Knox stood there, reveling in his so-called victory, while the guests clapped and nodded in approval. She needed to get out of there. Setting her untouched champagne flute on a nearby table, Ivy turned on her heel and made her way toward the door, keeping her stride steady, controlled. She could feel the weight of lingering stares as she exited the grand hall, but she didn't stop, didn't let her expression falter. Not yet. Once outside, the crisp night air hit her like a slap, sharp and sobering. She crossed the driveway in quick, determined steps, sliding into her car, and gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The moment the door shut behind her, the facade cracked. What the hell is going on? Knox had never cared about the lake house, had always dismissed it as a waste of space. But now, standing in front of their entire family, he had claimed it as his own without hesitation. That meant one of two things. Either he was lying, or someone was lying to him. Her heart pounded as she sped toward her home, headlights slicing through the darkness. The second she arrived, she rushed inside, heading straight for the drawer where she had hidden the wooden box, the one Henry had given her 3 weeks ago. With shaky hands, she pulled it out and flipped open the lid. There it was. The deed. Official, notarized, legally binding. Dated 6 months ago. Ivy exhaled sharply, her pulse thrumming in her ears. This wasn't some last-minute decision. Henry had made this choice long before he passed. And then, nestled beneath the papers, she saw it, a folded letter, aged at the edges, his handwriting unmistakable. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. Ivy, I have transferred the lake house to you, because you are the only one who truly understands and loves it. I know Knox may not be happy, but this is the right decision. I trust you to do what is right. Henry. Ivy's chest tightened. Henry knew. He had anticipated Knox's reaction. He had trusted her to handle it. Which meant Knox was lying. Or worse, someone had fed him a lie. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. If Knox wasn't the one behind this, then who was? She grabbed the papers and the letter, stuffing them back into the box before slamming the lid shut. Her hands clenched into fists. There was only one way to find out. The moment Ivy stepped back into the grand hall, the air seemed different. The laughter had died down, conversations reduced to low murmurs. Knox stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, looking every bit like the heir to an empire. But when his gaze met hers, his smirk faded. Ivy didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of him. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but sharp as a blade. Knox, we need to talk. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance. Amusement. But he nodded, setting his drink down and following her to a quieter corner of the room. The moment they were alone, Ivy pulled the wooden box from her purse and flipped it open, revealing the deed and the letter. Explain this, she demanded. Knox's brows knitted together as he picked up the papers, his gaze scanning over them. And then, something strange happened. His expression shifted, not to anger, not to guilt, but to genuine confusion. What the hell is this? He muttered. Ivy narrowed her eyes. You tell me. Because according to this, Henry transferred the lake house to me 6 months ago. Which means whatever paper you have. It's a lie. Knox's grip tightened on the letter. His jaw clenched. And that's when Ivy saw it, the subtle, involuntary twitch in his fingers. Recognition. Shock. Knox hadn't known. This wasn't his game. Which meant someone else had been playing them both. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Knox's grip on the papers tightened, his eyes flicking between the notarized deed and the handwritten letter. His confidence, the unwavering arrogance he always carried, was gone. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, more to himself than to Ivy. Ivy crossed her arms. It makes perfect sense, Knox. You were never supposed to inherit the lake house. Henry left it to me. Legally. So either you're lying, or someone lied to you. That's when it happened. A sharp intake of breath. Not from Knox. From behind them. Ivy turned just in time to see Teresa, Knox's girlfriend, standing a few feet away, her complexion suddenly pale, her hands clenched at her sides. And then, without a word, she bolted. The room, once filled with murmuring guests and polite conversation, stilled as Teresa pushed past the crowd, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a frantic rhythm. "Teresa!" Knox called, but she didn't stop. The realization hit him a second later. He cursed under his breath and took off after her, shoving past stunned guests. Ivy stood frozen for a split second before she followed, her pulse racing. The Grand Estate's front doors slammed open as Teresa rushed out into the night. She had ditched her usual composed, polished demeanor. Her movements were desperate now, panicked. Knox caught up to her near the fountain in the front courtyard, grabbing her wrist and yanking her back. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" His voice was low, dangerous. Teresa yanked her arm free, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. You weren't supposed to find out like this." Ivy stopped a few feet away, watching them carefully. Knox's expression hardened. "Find out what, Teresa?" Teresa swallowed, eyes darting between him and Ivy. "I did it for us, Knox." "For us?" "Did what?" His voice was deadly quiet now. Teresa ran a shaking hand through her dark curls, as if trying to gather herself. But it was too late for that. "The lake house," she admitted. "I arranged everything. The papers. The transfer." She hesitated, and then her voice dropped to a pleading whisper. "Knox, I was trying to help you. You deserved more than just a crumbling old house. I was making sure we could sell it, get something real out of it." Knox took a step back, his face unreadable. "You forged a will. Lied to my entire family. Lied to me." "It wasn't a lie." Teresa snapped. "That house is worthless to Ivy. But if we sold it, we could invest, buy something better, something that actually matters. Knox, don't you see? I did this for you." For the first time that night, Ivy saw something she had never seen in Knox before. Defeat. Betrayal. His shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his jaw easing, not because he was calm, but because he was done. "You did this for me." His voice was eerily calm. Teresa nodded quickly, stepping closer. "Yes, I." "Then why do I feel like the only person who gained anything from this was you?" Teresa flinched. Ivy didn't need to hear another word. She had her answer. Teresa had orchestrated everything. And now, she had lost. Knox exhaled slowly and turned away. When he looked at Ivy, his face was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "She's the one who did it. She used me." Ivy didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The truth had finally come to light. The truth had shattered the night, leaving nothing but the weight of betrayal hanging between them. Teresa was gone. The guests had dispersed, whispering among themselves as they left the estate. Now, only Ivy and Knox remained outside, standing beneath the cold glow of the courtyard lanterns. Knox had barely moved since Teresa's confession. His shoulders were tense, his fists clenched at his sides. The man who had walked into this party so sure of himself, so untouchable, was now standing in the wreckage of his own illusions. Ivy watched him carefully. For years, Knox had looked at her with resentment. She had felt it in every passing glance, every clipped word. To him, she had always been Henry's favorite, the one who got all the attention, the one he had been forced to compete with. But tonight, she saw something different in his eyes. Not anger. Not arrogance. Just loss. She took a slow breath, stepping closer. "There's something you need to know, Knox." He didn't look at her. "If it's another lie, I don't want to hear it." "It's not," she said firmly. "It's the truth. And it changes everything." That made him glance up, suspicion flickering across his face. Ivy held his gaze. No more secrets. No more half-truths. It was time. I'm not Henry's granddaughter. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, cutting through the silence like a knife. Knox frowned, shaking his head slightly. What? I'm not his blood. I was never part of the Wilder family, Ivy continued, her voice steady. Henry took me in when I was a child. My mother died when I was too young to remember her. I was just an orphan. Henry chose to raise me. That's all. Knox stared at her, unblinking. His lips parted slightly, as if forming words he couldn't quite say. No, he said finally, his voice raw. No, that's not possible. It is. And it always has been, Ivy said quietly. Knox shook his head again, taking a step back. She could see the way his mind was racing, replaying every memory, every moment where he had seen her as his competition. So all this time, his voice was hoarse. You weren't Henry's real granddaughter. No. A dry, bitter laugh escaped him. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements sharp and restless. So what the hell was I even jealous of? Ivy didn't answer. Because they both knew. Knox had spent years resenting her, believing she had been handed everything because of her bloodline. But now, he realized the truth was far worse. She had never been given anything because of birthright. She had earned Henry's trust, his love, without it. God, Knox whispered, exhaling harshly. He turned away, his back rising and falling with uneven breaths. I wasted so much time hating you. Ivy felt something tighten in her chest, but she didn't move closer. You didn't hate me, she said, her voice softer now. You hated the idea of me. The version of me that you created in your head. Knox was silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned back to her. His eyes, for once, held no anger. No bitterness. Just exhaustion. And now I don't know what to do with the truth. Ivy studied him for a long moment before she spoke. Then maybe it's time you figure it out. The weight of the truth still hung between them, thick and suffocating. Knox hadn't spoken since Ivy's confession, and she hadn't pushed him to. What was there left to say? For years, he had resented her. Compared himself to her. Hated her for the love their grandfather had given so freely. And yet, in the end, none of it had been because of blood. Henry had chosen her. Because she deserved it. Ivy sighed, breaking the silence. I don't want to fight anymore, Knox. His gaze flickered to her, guarded. So, what? You expect me to just forget everything? No, she said simply. I expect you to learn from it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of neatly arranged legal documents. Knox's brow furrowed as she extended them toward him. He took them hesitantly, his fingers tightening around the edges as he scanned the text. His breath hitched. What the hell is this? His voice was barely above a whisper. The official transfer papers, Ivy said, watching him carefully. The lake house belongs to you now. Knox's head snapped up, his eyes searching hers for some kind of trick. What? It's yours, Knox, she repeated, her voice unwavering. Henry always wanted you to find your own way. Maybe this house will help you do that. His grip on the papers tightened. No. This doesn't make sense. You fought me on this, why the hell would you just hand it over? Ivy exhaled softly. Because I don't need it. Knox flinched, as if the words physically struck him. But you, he shook his head, his voice thick with something unreadable. This was Henry's final gift to you. You loved that house, Ivy. You. I loved Henry, she corrected gently. The house was just a place. And I think I think it was never meant to be mine forever. Knox stared at her, silent. She took a step back, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Goodbye, Knox. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Knox didn't stop her. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there, alone on the front steps of his home, watching as Ivy disappeared into the night, leaving him behind with nothing but the house, the papers in his hand. And the realization that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he had won anything at all. The lake house was quiet. For the first time in his life, Knox Wilder was truly alone. The grand estate, the endless parties, the expensive suits, none of it mattered out here. The lake stretched endlessly before him, the water dark and still beneath the silver glow of the moon. The wooden floors creaked under his weight as he moved through the house, a place that once felt like nothing more than an outdated relic, but now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like home. At first, he had convinced himself that it was just nostalgia. That living here, surrounded by Henry's memories, would eventually feel natural. That the anger, the resentment, the years of misplaced jealousy would fade. But they didn't. Because every time he walked through these halls, every time he sat on the porch overlooking the lake, every time he ran his fingers over the old wooden desk in Henry's study, one thought consumed him. Ivy should be here. She was the one who had sat beside Henry in this very room, listening to his stories. She was the one who had understood him, who had loved this place long before Knox ever gave it a second thought. She was the one who should have stayed. But he had let her go. No, he had pushed her away. And now, the only thing that truly mattered was the one thing he had lost. Knox didn't think. He just acted. By the time he reached Ivy's new apartment, the sun was setting, casting the city skyline in deep hues of orange and gold. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood outside her door, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had spent his whole life fighting for power, for control, for recognition. But tonight, he wasn't here to fight. He knocked. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, finally, the door cracked open. Ivy. She blinked in surprise, her gaze flickering over him like she was trying to piece together why the hell he was standing in front of her. Knox? His throat felt dry. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed 100 different speeches. But now, standing in front of her, all he could do was look at her, the woman who had turned his world upside down and somehow, without even trying, made him want to be better. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice quieter than he expected. Ivy hesitated, then sighed, stepping aside. Make it quick. He stepped in, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat as he glanced around. It was a simple place, nothing like the grand estates they had both grown up in. And yet, there was warmth here. A kind of peace he hadn't known in years. She crossed her arms. So, what is it? Knox took a slow breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze. I was wrong. That made her pause. About what? About everything, he admitted. About you. About Henry. About us. A flicker of something crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. Knox. Just listen, he interrupted, stepping closer. I spent my whole life chasing after things I thought I deserved. Power. Respect. This house, this family name. I thought they meant everything. And then you walked away, and I realized none of it mattered. Ivy's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Knox exhaled, his voice rough with something dangerously close to vulnerability. Ivy. You were always the only one who truly understood Henry. And now I see that you're also the only person who has ever truly understood me." She sucked in a quiet breath. "And I don't want to waste any more time pretending that doesn't matter," he finished, his voice lower now, more certain. "I don't want the house. I don't want the money. I want you." Silence. For the first time in his life, Knox Wilder had no backup plan. No strategy. Just her. Finally, Ivy spoke. "You're serious?" "I am." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any trace of the old Knox, the man who had once been more enemy than anything else. But that Knox was gone. And for the first time, she saw someone else entirely. Someone real. Someone worth trusting. The lake house hadn't changed. The wooden beams still groaned softly in the morning wind. The air still carried the scent of pine and old books. The lake, stretching endlessly beyond the back porch, remained as still and serene as it had always been. But something was different. This time, Knox wasn't alone. Ivy stood beside him, her hands resting lightly on the porch railing. They had arrived late in the afternoon, but neither of them had rushed inside. Instead, they simply stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the water catching the last golden rays of daylight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Knox exhaled. "I found another letter," he said quietly. Ivy turned to him, brows knitting together. "From Henry?" Knox nodded, pulling a folded, slightly worn piece of paper from his coat pocket. He hesitated for a moment before handing it to her. Ivy took it carefully, unfolding the page with steady fingers. Henry's handwriting, familiar and strong, filled the page. "Knox, you've spent so much of your life trying to prove yourself. To me. To the world. But what you don't see, what I've always seen, is that you were never lacking. You just needed to stop searching for worth in the wrong places. The lake house was never about property. It was never about legacy. It was about understanding what truly matters. I always hoped you'd find that one day. And I always knew Ivy would be the one to show you how. Take care of her, Knox. And let her take care of you. You'll be a better man for it. Henry." Ivy's breath caught as she read the last line. Slowly, she lowered the letter, turning back to Knox. He was watching her carefully, something vulnerable and real in his expression. "I spent so much time being angry," he admitted. "At Henry. At you. At everything I thought I deserved but never got. But I get it now, Ivy." He swallowed hard. It was never about deserving anything. It was about earning it. He took a step closer, his voice lower now, steadier. "And I want to earn this. With you." Ivy's lips parted slightly, but she didn't move away. Knox exhaled, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "You know, I think Henry had this planned all along. I found another note in his desk. He wrote that he always thought you'd end up being his granddaughter-in-law." A soft, surprised laugh escaped Ivy. "He said that?" Knox smirked. "Yeah. I ignored it at the time. Thought he was just being an old romantic." His expression softened. Turns out, he was just right. Silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with unspoken resentment or unsaid words. It was something else entirely. Finally, Knox reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers with a quiet certainty. "This house was yours, Ivy. But if you let me, I want you to share it with me." Ivy studied him for a long moment. The man in front of her wasn't the same Knox she had known for years. He wasn't the rival she had fought, the bitter grandson who had spent a lifetime chasing things that didn't matter. This was a man who had changed. Who had finally found something worth holding on to. A slow smile curved her lips. Then let's make it ours. Knox let out a breath, his grip tightening just slightly. And for the first time, standing on the porch of Henry Wilder's lake house, they weren't two people fighting over a legacy. They were just Ivy and Knox. And this was their beginning.